Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Retuning Your Firm. As you'll see from the slide, episode 66. And we're looking at three things today. Reputation, which I think with what's going on in the political world is fairly high on the list for many people. Something very different, but as people start to go back to work and slightly more, I saw today that London transport numbers are up 20% or so over the last week. What about tours? What about ways to actually encourage people to come back? And the last one, we're going to be doing a poll, which is looking at the state of strategy, which is, I think, something that has possibly taken a bit of a back seat to operations over the past couple of years. And I think now that things are beginning to settle in something resembling normality, to what extent is strategy now going to be coming on? So, welcome to everybody. And as I said, I'm Richard Chaplin. I'm the founder and chief executive of the Managing Partners Forum. And it's great to be with you today. I'd just like to firstly introduce our panel for today. And the panel members are as follows. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Laurence Evans. And Laurence is the CEO of Reputation Leaders. And he's going to be talking about sustaining your firm's reputation. Welcome, Laurence.
Thank you, Richard.
Our second guest is Andy Seeley. Now, Andy is the interim HR director of, and was at CBRE and other well-known organizations, but he's also a London tour guide. And one of the areas that we thought would be interesting to explore is the extent to which there are well-being and learning benefits of guided walks and tours. So welcome, Andy. Jeremy Beard, joining us very shortly. He's just coming from a medical appointment, so I won't be able to spotlight him for you at this point, but he will be with us very, very shortly. And as I mentioned, yours truly, obviously, Richard Chaplin, the founder and executive director of the forum. So I think it's going to be a really interesting show, and I'm really looking forward to exploring those issues with Laurence and Andy and hearing Jeremy's thoughts from his managing partner forum perspective. Before we move on to the actual, excuse me, the presentations from our two presenters, if you recall, we will be doing a poll. State of strategy is the poll for today. And also, I thought I'd just quickly run through some forum news. Firstly, to say that hundreds of people are watching the videos from past shows. It's very easy. You go to the forum website under Retuning Your Firm, and then you can keyword it or by a particular presenter. So don't miss out and do share the word, because we think it's an important resource that's going to help a lot of people. I mentioned last couple of weeks ago when we had our last show that the Mentor Match program was about to be launched. It has now been launched, and it's a free service in collaboration with PM Forum. And what we're doing there is identifying and bringing together both mentors and mentees. And then the platform provides a secure, confidential place for both parties to engage in and to track really all aspects of the mentoring relationship. Now, where we're at the moment is we're currently signing up mentors because we want a good group of mentors, and we'll be opening up to mentees in a few weeks' time once we've got a good faculty, maybe that's the right word, of mentors. So if you're thinking about maybe giving something back and are interested in doing that, again, go to the website and look under Mentor Match, and you'll find lots more about it. You may be aware, if you've been on the show for a year or so, we have been doing a lot of work with particularly Oxford Brookes and other business schools around fast track innovation. We had a summit a year ago to look at the project. And since then, we've been working hard to put together an interactive version and also to give people a bespoke design sprint. And that will be, we're currently planning an innovation summit, probably in May, at which we can launch that guide. So again, watch out for that. And last, but absolutely by no means least, the 2022 awards are currently open for submissions until the end of next month, until the end of February. So get sharpening your pencils, however it is you decide to put in those applications, because this is our 20th anniversary. And obviously we're very eager that it should be an amazing success. So thank you for that. That's the forum news for today. What I'd like to also just kind of remind you is that, and this comes from UK government, where they were kind enough to say that your poll results are incredibly valuable in our analysis during these dynamic times. So let's just look back at the poll you did a couple of weeks ago. And if you recall, what we did was the quarterly tracker. Now, the quarterly tracker is something we've been running, well, pre-COVID, to be honest. That goes back about 10 years. Now, I know that Laurence, who's talking today, does a lot of research. So I think I would best describe this as a barometer rather than formal research. But it is something that I do think has been particularly well received by particularly the people who, well, somebody said to me today, you threw us a lifeline during COVID. And I think this tracker was probably very much part of the piece. And we'll show you a few slides, not too many in a second, but just what were the key headlines coming from the tracker from a couple of weeks ago? Well, firstly, almost everybody was projecting expansion. And that was expansion and levels of activity in new work and also in headcount. Welcome, Jeremy. Good morning. So that was the first bit of research that came through. The second one was that when it actually came to where partners, at the end of the day, their discussions do carry a lot of weight, where were they focusing their efforts? And finance was very key, finance cash flow, very top, but marketing remains very, very high on the list. And I think in a way that makes sense because the way that firms used to market and the way they currently market has changed, not only because of the digital marketing world, but also because of the way that one engages with clients in a virtual world is fundamentally different than when it's face-to-face, as I think most of us found out. We have Andy coming in today, who's has an HR background. And again, I don't think that'll probably be any great surprise to him. But if you're looking at what do firms think that people are going to contribute most to achieving their business goals, people, all the areas that come out are all really tied up with people management. And I'll show you a little bit more of that in a sec. In terms of the priorities, having a clear purpose. I was joking. I said this may be to do with having New Year's resolution, but actually it is having a clear purpose. And then developing skills are very much seen as the key priorities. And in terms of what's getting in the way, what are the constraints? The skills, again, lack of in this case, and the employee turnover. I mean, the people who have said to me, we cannot get the people, we're really selling it, we're getting lots of work coming in, but we're just finding it impossible to get the people. Now, the challenge there, I think, is often around the middle manager, who was probably very empathetic with their staff during early stages of lockdown. How are you going to make sure that they continue to engage with their staff? Many of them will be working 2, maybe 3 days a week from home at a time when they are under huge pressure, because typically it's the ones in the middle who have to do really a lot of running around when activity levels start going up. And this is when firms are going back to the top, are all projecting expansion, which is, well, let's hope there are the clients for them. In terms of office space, only about a quarter of firms are now expecting to reduce their office space. That was up to about 70% going back 2 years ago, back in March, April. And I think there's a general move. It's a bit hard to tie it down yet, but I think there are firms now kind of expecting people to spend a bit more time in the office than they did back in October when we last did the quarterly. And I think this is probably, in a way, the more positive outcome is that there was, if you call it, disconnect between the extent to which firms thought of themselves as on track for what we called post-COVID success. Thanks to London Business School for that thinking. But there was a big gap with clients. It was like half the clients were on track compared with firms. That gap has narrowed significantly in the last tracker. So I think now people are now saying, actually, no, our clients are also in a fairly good place too. And that's encouraging if you're expecting to expand, obviously. So let's just look at 2 or 3 of those charts. And if you've got a small screen phone, I apologize, but I'll briefly explain it to you. The blue is expansion and the red is contraction. And it goes way back to a year ago. So the 1st of February of 2020, when the blue was in the ascendancy and there was not much red. And if you look at what it was like 2 weeks ago, it's pretty similar. But we had a pretty sort of up and down seesaw space in the middle. That was during the pandemic. Each of those dots is a survey that we did. So there's quite a lot of data there, and it's a fairly clear pattern. Now that's just as true for activity levels as it is for headcount, as it is for new workflow. This one's a little bit busier, but if you kind of go for the light blue line, that's finance. And what we're doing there is we're saying that the finance one has pretty much been top of the list in terms of what matters. And then the other one, which has again kind of come up there, in fact, 1 month even went higher, was marketing and new business generation, which again has been up there. What's quite amusing, and you probably can't see this, is that actually to a great extent, the pattern from when we first started doing this pretty much hasn't really changed. The ones that haven't made it quite as high, people, but that's coming up again. Client service, which is the red one, and then the operational performance, which at times again was quite high, but now is seen to be, I think, slightly more business as usual, possibly. Going back to what I mentioned earlier about contributing to the firm goals, on the far right, again, if you've got a small screen, you probably can't see, getting the most from your team. We, if you recall, had a very interesting Mark Lacey was talking about the whole area of teamwork and how he built the firm around it with great success for Linear last 2 weeks ago. The second area is communicating effectively, which I know Laurence feels is fundamental to reputation, one of his key areas of focus. Making change happen, but again, moving slightly to the left and therefore not quite as important. Remember, these are only the top 3. They're all important, but these are the 3 that people ranked as the one that contributed most. Understanding and motivating others, again, that's another people one. And dealing with difficult situations, which was in terms of October, not there at all, but now in January, which is blue, it's now coming back. So again, this is a barometer. I don't think you should read too much into it, but I think the real message is that if you don't invest in managing your people, you're highly unlikely to achieve your goals. I think that's probably my takeaway. And in terms of office space, what's going on there? Well, the blue line, which is the more space or the same, has grown from about 30% back in April, a year or so, 2 years ago, up to, well, pretty much 70% now. And the bit in the middle, which is around 10% less, has kind of stayed small. So most people, it's kind of either or. They're either going for a significant reduction, which is typically 20% plus less, and it was some of them were up to 30%. But only a quarter of firms overall are now expecting to reduce their office space. So there is definitely a trend there that I think is interesting just to observe. So today, what are we going to do? We're going to be asking you today. We're going to be asking you today to complete a state of strategy poll. Now, the reason I'm talking about strategy is because a lot of the tracker we just did really is focusing on operational issues. What are the things that need to be done to ensure that the hybrid working works, to ensure that productivity levels remain, that client management is effective. And there is a fair amount of evidence that has meant that the balance of strategy and operations has been fairly strongly focused into the operations side. In other words, what have we got to do to keep the show on the road? And possibly less into the strategy, which is how we're going to be successful in 3-5 years' time. What do we need to do now in order to get to the right place? So what's the poll cover? We want to understand who owns strategy. We want to understand how often it's updated. Once every 2 years isn't going to be acceptable, I don't think, for most people. What are the most common strategy tools? What are the tools people are using in developing strategy? Picking up the point I mentioned a minute ago, what's the balance between strategy and operations? How people are tracking trends, because at the end of the day, strategy has to be a sort of, what should I say, context sensitive. It can't be completely set in stone. If things change, and we've got a lot of political change at the moment, potentially, who knows, then that may impact your strategy. How the thinking is kept up to date. A lot of people have went to business school 20 years ago and say, oh, this is the way you do things. Well, if you had a business school refresher, you might find some of that thinking's moved on a bit. So how do you actually keep your thinking about strategy up to date? What are the things that actually matter in developing a strategy, and which do you think are the more effective? And how positive are you about your own firm strategy? And this is anonymous, I hasten to add, in case you're concerned. So please be honest. I'll stop the 2/3 of you completed it, which is amazing. So thank you. So I will end the poll and I will share the results, which hopefully you should now be able to see. Yeah, cool. So let's just run through it. Who owns the strategy? And that is the board, very much 61%. And I think that's something which I have seen people who put managing partner hired there. So that's really helpful. How often is it updated? Fairly often. Somebody says never, or they don't have a strategy, but I think that's probably unusual. Fairly often. At your firm, which are the 3 most commonly used tools when developing strategy? Again, looking down the list, sorry, just get the whole lot. What are the ones that come through? Setting goals and measurable milestones, with exploiting profitable opportunities, are the two that appear to be the highest on the list, looking down them. And then sort of behind that, SWOT and PEST, and also the balanced scorecard. So those are the key tools that people are using in strategy. In terms of the balance of strategy and operations at the moment, 44% saying it's equal, which is great. That's really encouraging. I know when I asked the same question about a year ago, perhaps a bit less, it was very much more tilted towards operations. So that's encouraging to see. But still, we've got 40–50% who say that there is more emphasis placed on ops than on strategy, and a mere 6% who say it's the other way around. So I think it would still be fair to say that the firms where strategy is given greater attention compared with operations are few and far between, which I think is a shame. I think you're missing a trick on leadership terms, quite frankly. In terms of how you're actually doing, how you're tracking it, it's fairly informal. I think that's probably the best way to describe the trends. Some people doing environmental scans. How do you stay up to date? Again, it's briefings and alerts, so it's a fairly passive way of staying up to date. Some people going to conferences, specialist groups. Very few people are actually working with business schools or doing anything more in that space. What are the most important activities in developing a strategy? Well, again, this is, I think, Roger Martin's list, if I recall. It's a great list. So identifying the important strategic challenges that the firm is facing is the one that comes through first. And then subsequently, the clarifying firm's core markets, and then kind of considering why clients choose the firm, articulating the firm's competitive advantages. Those are the ones that are important in terms of developing a strategy. If we then move on to the next one in terms of where have you been good? Where have you been effective as a firm? And again, it's a little bit different. Identifying the important strategic challenges is still up there at the top, and that's good. But some of the other ones, clarifying core markets, are quite a lot lower. Considering why clients choose the firm is the one that comes through second there. In terms of least, what are the things you think you're less good at? And again, this is all anonymous, you'd be pleased to hear. Thinking about capabilities, in other words, what are necessary to win in the future, which is a very important key aspect of strategy. Checking that the management systems actually support your choices. Those are the two that come through really quite strongly there as being ones which are areas for improvement, I think they call it elegantly, don't they? And then lastly, how would you actually rate your, how would you describe it, your firm's strategy? Well, we don't have any saboteurs, that's helpful. They're the people who are critical without being asked. A group of people are not that positive. Fair amount of people are neutral. Neutral doesn't always mean positive in English, as we both know. And about 40% would speak highly, mostly if asked, some without being asked. So not a completely, what should I say, clean scorecard there, but always interesting. So I'm going to hand over now to the first of our guests. And if you recall, that is Laurence Evans. And excuse me, Laurence is the CEO of Reputation Leaders. And I'm going to be talking to us about how do you sustain your firm's reputation. Though I suspect we'll be talking about things other than firms in the context of your talk. So over to you, Laurence.
Richard, thank you, and delight to be back with you all again. And great to hear some positive news on the horizon of firms expanding both jobs, client work, and so on, and what otherwise I would describe as probably some grey clouds of reputation, particularly when the latest Interim Trust Barometer shows that trust in the UK in government and media is at historic lows, based on pillars of competence and character, I suspect. So I am the CEO of Reputation Leaders. We're a consultancy that helps firms like you align their behaviours, their communications, their reputation. I was with Edelman for 7 years, helping to run the Edelman Trust Barometer. I also sat on the ACCA Board of Ethics for 2 years. And got involved in ethics around the profession. If you haven't seen it, I would suggest you read the latest Interim Trust Barometer. It's very informative. The bad news is that trust in government and media is at a record low. The good news is that trust in my employer is still relatively high. So I think that presents an opportunity. However, having said that, the big four are under the spotlight at the moment for audit failures, fines, and reputational damage. And ultimately, I think the whole audit profession wins or loses when the big four suffers reputational damage. Just to give you some quick reminders of recent horror stories that you've probably heard of in the press. KPMG UK was fined £3 million by the FRC for serious failings around conviviality. It stands accused of misleading regulators around the audit of Carillion. PwC is accused of missing warning signs around Chinese property developer Evergrande. E&Y was found to have violated accounting standards during its assessment of Wirecard. And now Deloitte is now being pursued by Tongaat over its role in the accounting scandal, which resulted in the share collapse. Reputation challenges across the board. And if that wasn't enough in news this week, the incoming chair of the UK accounting watchdog, Sir John du Plessis, has warned auditors that they need to cooperate with regulators as the sector becomes subject to an overhaul of FRC governance and its increasingly more stringent replacement, ARGA. So scrutiny is up. What do I take from this? My take is that no audit firm is immune from a reputational crisis. That trust is actually fundamental to what audit firms sell in the basis of your competent, ethical, professional advice and behavior. And beyond that, beyond a legal right to operate, societal right to operate fundamentally comes down to a belief and a trust in your competence, character, and the way that you conduct yourself. Also in how well you communicate when there is a crisis. So the question that Richard raised is opposite. How can you sustain your firm's reputation at a time when there may be decreased faith in the audit profession as a whole? First of all, what is reputation? Well, reputation, in our view, is brand is the promise that you make, and reputation is how well your stakeholders think you're living up to it. So it's, on one hand, it's your performance, everything you do, but secondly, it's your conduct, how well you do what you do and how you do it. And increasingly, the conduct is the lightning rod. Four things I think that apply to the audit profession, and I've put it into 4 Ps. One is professionalism, a trust in your ethical and professional behavior. Secondly is performance, people's belief that you have the competence and expertise to do the job well. Thirdly, proactivity, a willingness to quickly address any faults or systemic issues when they arise. And fourthly, public relations, just being transparent and honest in your communications internally and externally. So given that, I've put together some thought starters on what a local audit firm can do to boost a reputation. And the first thing I would say is emphasize your board and your managing partner's commitment to audit quality and the maintenance of standards. Reputation starts and is led from the top. Secondly, I would highlight your personal and your local connections with clients. Long-term relationships are the foundation of trust. In terms of reputation failures, in my experience on sitting on the ACCA Board of Ethics, many failures were actually not around technical failure. They were largely failures in ethics that resulted from cultural and systemic issues in the firm rather than audit issues. I do think there is an opportunity, since there is 71% trust in UK employers, to build the increasing trust with your employees at this time by engaging in discussion around firms' values, not only the strategy, but the purpose, professional standards, ethical expectations, remote working, all the kinds of things. I think listening is as important as anything else you do to building reputation. And ultimately, I do think you need to have a crisis plan in place. You need to have a boiler statement if things go wrong, that say, this is what we stand for, this is who we are, and this is how we're going to address any issues. I do think there's an opportunity to participate in the broader discussion of what are the future standards of accounting and what audit should be. I think the audit profession needs to shape its future or risk having it shaped for it. And I would point to the fact that I have found there's a great variety of very useful tools that I've tapped into over the years. Some of them on the ethics side, for example, is the IBE, the Institute of Business Ethics, along with IESBA. The ACCA, I found a very useful resource. I'm familiar with Blueprint for Business in the Community. They do great work. And the FRC also for its faults, also has some pretty good guidance. But whatever you decide to do, and I think, as Richard said, it comes down to managing people, both clients and internally. Do take some action now positively as part of your strategy to think about how can we bolster and protect the reputation of our firm. So with that in mind, I'll hand back to you, Richard, and look forward to the panel discussion later.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks very much, Laurence. And words of wisdom there, I think, to all of us. I'm going to look forward to Jeremy's thoughts, who is obviously in the same accountancy world, and some of the challenges that he picks up from Laurence's thoughts. But before we hear from Jeremy, I'd like to now invite Andy Seeley to join us. Andy is an interim HR director. He had a distinguished career with CBRE and other big organizations in the past. But he's also a London tour guide. And what I thought was fascinating was this notion of, okay, we are now looking at ways to encourage people to come back to the office. And actually, maybe there are some well-being and learning benefits from guided walks and tours. Over to you, sir.
Thanks very much, Richard. Good morning, everybody. As Richard says, I had a sort of 30-year career, largely in HR as a practitioner. I did 5 years at PricewaterhouseCoopers as a consultant, and also more latterly at CBRE as an HR director. But I took a conscious decision in 2018 to leave after 12 years at CBRE, and I went into the contracting and interim game. And I also took a decision to kind of make a bit of a life change and study for this. I hope you can see it. It's my London Blue Badge tour guiding qualification that I got earlier this year. It took 2.5 years and 13 examinations. I have to say it was the hardest thing I think I've ever done. At the kind of high point of my exams, I had to have 80 5-minute presentations internalized in my head, because I got examined in things like St Paul's Cathedral, National Gallery, British Museum, Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, and so on and so forth. But I have to say, I absolutely love it. And if it gave me one thing, or a couple, it gave me lots of things, but a massive appreciation for art and architecture, the visual stuff that I hadn't had before. So I took this change of direction. So what do I do now? I still keep my hand in with HR, contracting and consulting, but I do guided walks and tours for companies and for private groups. And as Richard says, I'm going to try and give you a little bit of food for thought for how this may play as companies think about getting staff back into the office, because I've done a number of guided walks for companies like, well, obviously CBRE, I was there for some time, and Charles Taylor Insurance Services, Field Fisher, HSBC, ISG, and also other smaller practices like McLean Partnership and Ascend. And the guided walks tend to be popular because the main benefits I think that accrue from that are, there's an obvious well-being kind of payback, isn't there? You're out of the office, you're getting a bit of fresh air, you're getting your step count up, but there's also the obvious knowledge benefits that people get of the kind of context of the area in which we all now live and work. One of the walks that I do, which is very popular with companies, particular for their grads and their apprentices, and I've taken out grads and apprentices on this, is the City of London, the rise of money. So, you know, what was it that made this Roman settlement on the northern shore of the River Thames in AD 47, across the course of the next 2,000 years, become this kind of great metropolis, which is a magnet for international capital and for people. So we get a bit of context as we go through that. Other skills that I think from a learning and development perspective it helps with is things like storytelling, active listening, observation. I will say to my groups, you know, look up, look around, because we're very fortunate in London insofar as it's not a hugely planned city. Obviously, it was shaped by some huge events like the Great Fire of London and the bombing in World War II. But the built environment is really a mix of completely different styles, things like neoclassical styles, Gothic, Art Deco, and it's getting people to kind of drink that in as they walk around, take the earphones off and you know, pay attention. There's also, as I said, storytelling, and sometimes on particular stops, I will say something, and I might invite one of my audience to maybe do a minute or two, kind of bringing that to life themselves. I think obviously the one of the things that companies say to me is the incentive that it gives to bringing people back into the office. It's rather than the kind of classic social of just kind of piling down the pub, which I'm not kind of knocking, and obviously there's still a place for socializing and doing that and going for a drink. So a lot of my work happens in the evening around about 4 o'clock, when companies have maybe had a strategy day, or they brought people together. They maybe want to do a 2-hour walk and then go, they maybe go for a drink after that. Ones that are particularly popular, I've said about the City of London and the ascent of money. Spitalfields is very popular because that's a theme of immigration and kind of regeneration with that area. One area that's very popular is Southwark, and I headline that as my Saints and Sinners, Pilgrims and Prisons Walk. But there's a number that I do, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about that outside of this forum. But that's really quick summary of the main benefits of taking people on guided walks and site tours as well, because I do site tours. Thank you.
Well, that was very different from some of the things that we've talked about on previous episodes of the show, but I think it's important that we touch the places that are going to be of importance. And I think actually offering that slightly more varied experience when people get back to the office is something that I think a lot of managing partners may well want to think through, or particularly the HR and L&D people on the call. Jeremy, good morning, welcome. Happy New Year. I believe we haven't actually spoken because
morning
your
everyone.
First episode. So please give us your thoughts on Laurence and reputation, and then the extent to which the idea of doing tours and the rest resonates with you as well.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. If it's not too late, we're probably just about in time. Hopefully everyone has come back re-energized and re-enthused for the new year. Yes, first of all, thank you to Laurence and Andy for your presentations. Obviously, Laurence's in particular strikes a chord with me, and I think there's some very interesting thoughts and views there, which I'll perhaps comment on. I think first of all, the culture that Laurence touched on is a key point. Changing the culture of the organization to focus on quality, to focus on regulation as there is a shift in the marketplace. Changing the culture of clients as well, I'd also throw in there, and I don't think it's I know a lot of the focus and emphasis around the topics that Laurence was talking to is around audit firms, but of course let's not forget the white paper that is driving a lot of this change is about restoring trust in audit and corporate governance. So there's an awful lot of emphasis on the corporates and the way in which they behave. And I think it's important not to forget that, and changing that culture. Obviously, we've come through an era where audit tendering was common, was a common thing that we had to go through, and quite often an audit tender process, and perhaps I'm talking 5 years ago rather than today, was around driving price down. And inevitably, if you drive price down, then that will impact on the quality of the work that is done. So I think there's a changing culture in organizations, and we are changing our culture around that. But I think there's a cultural change that is needed in the corporate and organizational environment as well. So that was my first comment. Just looking at Laurence's 4 pillars of reputation, I think it was. Again, I would very good information there, and professionalism, performance. I would highlight the proactivity and public relations. I think in the current climate, and we've had our own experiences. It's almost inevitable that you're going to rub shoulders with the regulators at some point. and it's about how you deal with that and how you respond to that that is critical, I think. And as I say, we've had our own situation that we particularly that we had to deal with, which was fine. But how you deal internally, how you deal with the staff, how you talk to them, and also how you talk to clients. And again, it's a fine balance with some of these things, as was a fairly low level matter, but it was in the public domain. And of course, it's a balance. You don't want to highlight it and bring it to everyone's attention, but at the same time, you've got to address it and make sure that people don't think you've just covered it up or swept it under the carpet. So how you deal in that area is key, and address it quickly, as Laurence said. Admit your failings and talk about what you are going to do to put it right. The other factor I would also say is we are in a fast changing market in terms of this whole area of quality and regulation, and quite often when you do have some issues, they happen 3, 4, 5 years ago, in many cases even longer in some cases. So where you are today might be very different to where you were 3, 4, 5 years ago. So again, telling that story and getting that message across is important, that actually a lot of these points have already been addressed. We are investing significantly in quality. I'm delighted to say that we have just agreed as a partner group to bring in 2 independent non-executives into the business. One very much to help us with development of the business, and if you like, with a commercial head on, with a strategy head on, etc., broaden our thinking. But the second independent non-executive will be from an audit quality point of view. So we will bring someone from another organization who will help us and challenge us in that whole audit quality area. So that's just another example of our investment in quality in that area, in addition to the permanent resource that we're building up in that quality and training environment. I think my next point probably to comment on was perhaps coming back to a couple of broader things. Absolutely agree with Richard's comments earlier on around staff. Still the biggest challenge is resource. There's an awful lot of work around, but the challenge is resourcing that and providing support for that. That is front and center of our strategy that we are just about to sign off, our next 3-year strategy. A whole people strategy is critical over the next 3 years. The expectations of the next generation of trainees, of auditors, etc., is very different, and we are starting that with some quite heavy investment into our HR team. So we are building that team out. We've hired a head of learning and development. We're hiring HR business partners for each of our critical service areas, which are really audit, tax, business support. So that's very much where our focus is at the moment in terms of people. Let's build the HR team and ensure there's proper support there before we then roll out what the various other strategic things that we have to do. On a more practical and operational level, certainly we feel that we would like to get people coming back to the office and back on client site more and more. Now there has to be a balance with that. Obviously, people have got used to flexibility, and I think that's very important. We're certainly not looking to take that away at all. But the efficiency of the delivery of our services has been affected by not being together. The whole training piece, certainly for our trainees, has suffered because they've not been sitting together. So we are very keen to get our, in particular in the audit areas, our audit teams together. That might be some time in the office together, and that might be on client site together at times as well. And we'll still provide that flexibility. There'll still be, people will have flexible hours and flexibility of working at home, but just trying to get people back face to face, and picking up on some of Andy's points, very important, and building an event structure over the next few months that will encourage people to come back in and do things together. You know, an awful lot of our employee base, I think it's probably as much as a third, perhaps more than that, are within 3 years of leaving university. So they're all graduate trainees. So, you know, their work and their social life is very much interacted and integrated, and creating an environment for them to work well, but also to socialize, I think, is a responsibility that we have as well. So yeah, all that is very good. Richard, I think that was all the key points I was going to cover at this stage. I don't know whether you want to fire any questions at me.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'll probably just go to Laurence, if I may. And
yes,
Laurence, just picking up the point that was made by Jeremy around, it's actually a corporate governance issue as much as an audit quality issue. We were reading that, you know, certain if management is insistent on being fraudulent, it's quite hard for the auditors to pick it up. So how do you keep that balance between the auditor, who is fundamentally an intermediary, but obviously with a very important opinion, and management that's actually driving the business and therefore perpetrating fraud or doing naughty things?
Great question, and I think Jeremy raised some good issues which I'll come up to. Let me just mention that with the focus on ESG investment now, which is due to be $53 trillion by 2025, companies more broadly and investors are paying notice to the G part of ESG. It's still by far the biggest part of it, and governance across the board is key. A lot of business failure discussions do center around the role of management and the role of government support and government failures. But we can't escape the fact that in terms of the public's eye, or in terms of investors or regulators, they just have a very high expectation of audit, perhaps an unrealistic view. And I think that the challenge, because reputation is perception, and I'll read this quote from the FRC, the auditor's responsibilities for identifying and reporting fraud is probably the area with the most misaligned expectations between the general public and the audit profession. So the challenge is, how do you align the public expectations with what is the audit reality? And that's something that Jeremy can speak to, but there are a couple of issues. First of all, I do think, and I agree with Jeremy, there's an opportunity to change the culture of your clients, particularly now with younger workers insisting on purpose in companies. It is actually an opportunity to remind your clients that not just the profit aims, but the purpose aims are actually fundamental to them being able to attract the right talent and the great resignation. So I think there is an opportunity to challenge culture at your own firm, but also to challenge culture at your clients' firms, to remind them of their purpose and their values and help to shape that, and to tell them that if they do that well in terms of governance, that investors will take note, that employees will take note, and it's a win-win. Jeremy does speak to the issue of public relations, and one of the important issues of that is that if you do get negative press, it often stays for years and years. For example, things like the Tesco audit failure, for example, still comes up in the press because journalists simply Google the last article and simply keep repeating it. And so it is important that you address it, but you address it in a way that if you're going to be quoted, at least be quoted for the right things and the right areas. It's challenging, right? It's challenging to meet these public expectations. But what encouraged me is that Jeremy said that they're basically investing in people. They're investing at people at a board level, at an HR level, and and so on. And that, I think, is the best response, is to just make the right investments in the right way and on the right people. But I'll almost throw it back to Jeremy and get his response to that.
I might, but I think it's probably
Yeah.
helpful if I could just bring Andy in here.
Yes.
Andy, as an interim HR director, 30 years in HR, you are a professional, an HR professional, and it must be music to hear some of the things that Jeremy was saying. Where do you see the role of HR looking into the next few years?
Well, it's changing sort of rapidly. I mean, obviously, we're dealing with people coming back physically into the office. I think the whole paradigm of work is changing. We're used to it, like we said earlier, I think before the call started, the notion of an employment contract where somebody is based in a particular fixed location. I think people will be much more peripatetic. I think the nature of the employment relationship is going to be very different. I mean, that's been changing for a long time, but much more flexible. And I think that people have got to put things. The whole contract with the employee has got to be one where the social conscience is very, very important. People are already, aren't they, sort of discerning where do they work? Is it an employer that kind of has the values that I want to form a contract with? So I think it's even more that kind of accelerated change is happening, and I think COVID's probably accelerated a lot of things that were already happening anyway in that regard.
Jeremy, perhaps bring you in here now. I've obviously had some thoughts from Laurence and around the reputation, and Andy around the people agenda. I mean, is that changing the role of the managing partner materially, do you think?
Is it changing the role of the managing partner? Possibly not. It's just your emphasis and focus is on slightly different areas, and that always changes, I guess, doesn't it, when things move on? But I don't think it particularly changes my role hugely. I think there's just a couple of comments I've come back to. First of all, I just wanted to make a comment. I think the audit profession did need a shake-up. I welcome the regulatory changes and the focus on quality. I think that is good. I think that's good for society. I think that's actually good commercially for us, because I think it will, there will be a difference between quality firms and quality auditors compared to perhaps others. So, and we are seeing now the FRC have a sort of graded firms that deal with public interest entities and that sort of thing. I think is good commercially for us as a business. So I welcome the changes. I do. There has to be some balance, obviously, but I just wanted to get that point across in case I didn't come across quite like that at the start. And just back to the client piece and the changing the culture of the client. Of course, the situation we're in at the moment, we have limited resource. We are turning client work away, and therefore, when we talk about the clients with the right culture, actually we can make that decision when we take them on. So we want to have that conversation that they appreciate the audit, they understand the importance of a good quality audit, and they have the right culture in their business, and it's not just purely driven by price and can you get in and out as quickly as possible and sign my clean audit report. So certainly the boot is a little bit on the other foot at the moment in terms of the auditor perhaps being more selective and choosing which quality clients they want to work with.
Laurence, how would you, again, we've only got a couple of minutes, so it's a bit of a quick question, but given there is that shift to much more of a focus on the onboarding process and making sure that the clients you have are the ones that you feel are going to work with you and for you, and how would you go about a marketing strategy to get the point across that a firm had changed in that area?
I completely agree with Jeremy that quality is both a differentiator and a commercial advantage. I would say that ultimately the quality of your clients and the quality of your people can either be a virtuous circle or a circle of descent. That you do get, the aim is to get to everyone wants to be where everyone else wants to be, as Barbara Corcoran once said. If you have a group of quality clients and other clients go, I want to be part of that. And if you have a group of employees that are high performing, high potential, fun to be with, people want to be with that. And that's, I think, if I'm putting words in Jeremy's mouth, that's where we're heading, right? Where quality exists at all levels, and the people you have and the clients you have, and then it becomes an attractive proposition to join. And equally well, it can also become a descending spiral if you get that wrong.
Thanks, Laurence. Just quickly bringing Andy in again, and again, if I may, wearing your HR hat. I mean, what sort of HR challenges would that focus on quality throw up, do you think?
Well, it's always having the right, the right people. And we alluded to skills shortages earlier, and I think that with a heavy emphasis on quality, I think you need the right people doing the right things for your organisation. I mean, one of the things that I know that Jeremy was talking about, the big investment in HR, and that is very encouraging. I think that one of the aspects of HR that is changing rapidly is we're used to these big kind of annual institutionalized, almost theatrical things like the annual appraisal process where people sit down, the annual engagement survey. Talking to a lot of my HR colleagues, those things are almost being challenged and kind of, and frequently being changed or dispensed with, so that you've got a lot more of an agile environment to be able to take regular pulse surveys on a lot more frequent basis, to have regular feedback using apps. So the world of work is definitely changing, and technology is helping with all of that. And I think that is helping to improve quality, because one appraisal once a year probably becomes historic after a couple of months. So yeah, that's my
thank you very much. And it's 10 o'clock. Doesn't time fly when you're enjoying yourself? So I'd like to thank today's panel. I'd like to thank Laurence for helping us understand a bit more, but reputation and brand are so intimately linked, and the one is about promises and the other is about delivering on those promises. Andy, for talking us through some really fascinating walks, which I know I'll definitely want to take advantage of, and also saying, well, actually there are some quite helpful aspects there about the people dimension. And Jeremy, for your helpful, thoughtful, honest assessment, as always, of where we're at. And thank you for sharing. I'd like to call the session to a close to now. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with the chairman of Arab and some other interesting people. So watch out for that one. And only remains to say, have a fantastic day. And thank you very much for being a great audience and for completing the poll. Bye for now.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks, Richard.
cheers.